Record. Hi, I'm Edwin Rutsch, Director of the Center for Building a Culture of Empathy, and this is our dialogues on how we're going to build a culture of empathy. And I'm so pleased I'm here with Michele Borba. Thanks so much for joining me for this call. We've been working a long time, but trying to set it up.
This was Tenacity 101 plus empathy. I am so looking forward to finally being able to speak with you. Thank you.
Yeah, and I am too, to speak with you. And just a little bit about you. You're the internationally renowned educational psychologist and expert in parenting, bullying, character development, and also the author of Unselfie, Why Empathic Kids Succeed in Our All About Me World. And yeah, this is great. So do you want to add anything else about yourself, about your background? And
no, the only thing that probably has helped me more than anything else that I can possibly imagine is that I've been able to speak all over the world. So I've now visited almost 43 countries, and kids are the kids everywhere and anywhere. They have the same needs, the same concerns, but there's some glorious things happening around the world.
Well, I'd love to hear about that. I know to write your book, you did a lot of traveling too, right? You just did a lot of research and went out there and were
it was a
interviewing
10-year
people.
project. So thanks for asking that, because it was really, I wanted to get it right. I had luckily some very renowned, wonderful colleagues from, Harvard, Santa Clara University, San Diego, who were able to just help me get all the research right. But then what I wanted to do above all else was go in and out of schools and actually see stellar things. If this is what the research says does work, show me somebody who's doing it right so we can actually see it and know that it can be replicated. And the best news is there's a lot of powerful things we can do. There's some really wonderful things that are happening.
Well, you've done a lot of interviews and a lot of those are online. So I was thinking, well, what would be really good to talk about? And, I was thinking about, like, what do you find is the best, maybe we could talk about the best practice skills, for learning empathy. Like, where do you really start? And I've got some ideas. I just wanted to hear, too, what yours were. And I thought we could maybe kick some ideas around, like, where do you see, like, the best starting point for learning and practicing and deepening empathy skills?
Well, I think the key is that I still see so many myths and misnomers about empathy. And in my case, I'm dealing as an educator, a psychologist, helping parents. I think the first step is we've got to start with the adult level to help them first realize that it can be cultivated. I can't tell you how many times when I'm doing parent sessions, the parents' mouths just open up, because they're not aware of it. They think it's just marked into a child's DNA, or it's a sibling thing, or it's a gender issue. And when I tell them first and foremost that you can cultivate it, that majority of our kids are already hardwired for it, but there are certain practices that work and don't work, that's the first buy-in. The second thing is I think they need to know the why, because it's a very different kind of a culture right now. It's certainly Mayberry is dead and gone. June Cleaver and Ward aren't there anymore. And we do know that empathy breeds in certain cultures far better. A certain school, a certain family, a certain neighborhood. So if we begin to start with why it matters and what's the culture look like, as opposed to now we're going to teach this particular skill, that backfires, especially in a classroom when the children don't see that the teacher's being too empathetic, or, okay, we're all talking about empathy and I go out on the playground and the bullying and the violence is so huge. We've got to start with the adults stepping up to the plate, having them maybe practice some of the listening skills, the communication, the being a little more open. All of those is either as parenting partners, as colleagues together. I was in Montreal, and I think one of the neatest things I saw were parlor groups that are starting up. And I said, what's a parlor group? And I said, well, we're concerned about empathy and the nosedive in it. And so what we decided to do is realize we can't do this alone. If we really want to get on board and make a difference in our kids' lives, we got to find like-minded people who support us. So what they did is they went into where they could, like church groups, I've seen it, Girl Scouts can do it, all kinds of leadership organizations. But what they did is go into classrooms and find about 8 parents who wanted to join. They found 8 was a good number. And then what they did is at least once a month, they started with, early with just coffee, and then they went to wine and cheese. But
Mm-hmm.
what they did is they discovered that it was really a wonderful opportunity to go through the newspaper and find an article about maybe empathy is dipping, or here's a cultural trend that we're really concerned about, or if all this technology may be taking away from our kids' emotional literacy, then what can we do? And it was that like-minded conversations that helped them realize, one, we can raise up a population of kids and we can make a difference. And two, they now had a support system. So I think parenting is pretty lonely these days. If you know somebody else is doing it, or a parent can say there's a great service opportunity for kids, or hey, let's do this together, or if you do this listening skill at home with your kids, I'll do it with my child so that they can practice it together. I think that's one of the simplest things I've seen anywhere, and I think we can replicate that.
Okay, so what I'm hearing there, just to kind of reflect my understanding of what you're saying. So to begin with, it's to convey that empathy is learnable skill.
Yes.
So you start with that, like, hey, you can learn it is learnable. It's not a fixed trait. So that kind of sets the stage. And then I was hearing that it's for the parents, like you're working in the school, with young people. And so it's for the parents to have a buy-in about why it's important for them to do this. So you want to show them, kind of give them explanation of why this is important. And then there's sort of the encouragement of bringing them together to have kind of a mutual support group for working together for, how you're going to foster empathy. It sounds like it's sort of like discussion groups, like have some coffee and beer and wine and have some sort of dialogue.
And then what you also do is you're getting empathy in our dinner, because empathy is always we, not me. So it's really helping the facility. Now let's go to the school a minute, or let's go to your office a minute, or whatever organization it is. When we're talking to a staff, what I need to really help them realize is that empathy is not a once a month activity, or it's not a word of the month, or it's not a worksheet. And what I see very often is that they think it is. Okay, now let me go get this program and start running off the activities. And every once in a while I can say I'm teaching empathy. But instead, let's start a little slower. Every faculty meeting, maybe it's a 5-minute conversation of what are you doing to build empathy, or what article have you seen that concerns it, or put everybody on a Google alert if there's an article that came up or a brand new piece of research. It's keeping it in our mind so we come a little more intentional, because we're so quick paced, and then we go, I can't do it because I've got too many other things going. No, let's just take one little thing and keep working on the same little thing until that practice or that habit or that activity or whatever it is that works seems to be one that we can go, hey, I can do it. And then it keeps breeding and breeding.
So it sounds there, you bring parents together or teachers together, and then they have to make sort of a commitment to have the intention, like this is what we want to do. This is maybe the culture of empathy that we want to create. And it's an ongoing sort of a practice and a process. It's not like, you have the one lesson and then that's kind of like the end of it for the rest of the year, or the word of the month you were saying, or the word. So it's really having that long-term practice and intention.
Well, and I think that's so critical, because just if we were doing this, or you're doing this all alone as an adult, and you go, I just read that book on selfie, or I just read The Empathy Habit, or whatever it is. We read it. How often do we apply it? What we want to do is make empathy in action. And how we do that is first through knowing what it is. And then, okay, now what's one little thing that's in my comfort zone that I can start practicing it until I can practice it over and over again. Now it becomes a habit, and I can add the second thing. So I think that's really the critical piece, no matter what your position is, as a parent, as a teacher, as an educator, as a counselor. The first thing is making it doable and realizing that this is something that we've got to do, and then we can.
Yeah, well, I think one of the things you mentioned, like defining what it is, and that's something that the empathy movement is sort of holding back, is like there's not a clear sort of agreed upon definitions. It seems like the academics keep creating new words, new terms. They overlap with each other and they overlap with other concepts. So it becomes, rather confusing about what we're talking about. And I had talked with Dan Batson, who is an academic who's been studying it for like 40 years or more. And he, just acknowledges that there is all these different ways people are using the term, and that what you need to do is, when you start your discussion, articulate what it is that you're meaning, and then sort of stick with it. And so I don't know, maybe it's a good time to just articulate what do you mean, when you're talking about empathy.
I am so right on with you, and I agree with him 1,000%, because I do almost daily some kind of a speech, an in-service, a workshop. And the first thing I do is define it. And I usually define it with a story, but I also say, because teachers are in their audience, a lot of times I put up a triangle and I say, think of it as an ABCs, the ABCs of empathy. But let's start with just one part, and that is A is affective. In fact, some of your kids have far more affective empathy than others. You can see them feeling with another person. They're reading Charlotte's Web and they're wiping away the tears. They're so distraught when they're watching the movie Dumbo. They come running in because somebody got hurt and they feel with that person. That's affective empathy. That's glorious. That's one kind, but that isn't the only kind. I want people to realize that kids may have different kinds of personalities and different kinds of temperament. The other kind is cognitive. That's the C. And that is the child who stops to try to understand. Oh, please clone that child. He's trying to understand where the other person is coming from. He doesn't have to agree, but he's thinking, and it's a more thinking capacity. It's a perspective taking kind of a capacity. But the final one is the B, so it's ABC. It's the behavior. It's okay, so I feel with you, or I understand with you, so what are you going to do about it? And I always tell parents, our job is to try to help our child not just feel it and know it, but do it, and to be able to activate it. It takes a long time. The real part of empathy is feeling with another human being, and it's a glorious commodity, because when we do so, I think that's the best way we open up our hearts, we get the best joy we have, we create a more peaceful world, we stop the divisions that are happening in the world, and we have a better family, we're a better parent, we're a better teacher. It's the betterment, and it's also the best antidote we've got to bullying, hate, racism, everything out there. That's what it is, and now we look at, so how do we do it?
Mm-hmm. Well, maybe I'll share a little bit of my view of the definition of empathy.
Sure.
I know the affective and cognitive terms. That's actually a more recent sort of a definition of it. And I personally am not comfortable with the affective and cognitive terms.
Sure.
So for me, the empathy starts with sort of a premise that we feel as human beings. We feel all the time. I know I feel. I mean, every day, I wake up, even in my dreams, I'm sensing the world around me, and I observe that other people are feeling as well. So the empathy for me is that it's a way that it's being sensitive to our felt experience. So we have like self-empathy is, feeling into my own experience. I feel excited, I feel maybe nervous, or I feel tired, or I feel hungry, or I feel curious. So I have these feelings. And so self-empathy for me is sensing those bodily sensations. And the empathy with another person, which is, I just would call empathy. So I see you, and I can actually feel to a degree into your experience. I can see you nodding your head. I see that, there's this feeling of, this sense of acknowledgement, I feel a sense of concentration, from you and so as a person is someone else is experiencing their feelings, the empathy is to feel into their experience and to follow along. And the definition that Carl Rogers used in the 50s, 60s, he was talking about you're a companion with someone else with their experience. You're not trying to tell them what to do, where to go, but you're a companion in their experience. So just to empathize with you is to follow along in your experience or into other people's experience. And the other part, the cognitive part, I could see it gets very confusing. Even the academics don't seem to be, they're not even consistent in how they define cognitive empathy. So I use the word imaginative empathy, that we can imagine ourselves in any situation. I can imagine myself in the future. I can imagine myself being you. So it's like this role playing. I can imagine myself being a carrot. You know, I mean, kids play these games, right? It's like, oh, I'm a carrot and you're a turnip, and what's the relationship? So we can imagine ourselves and an actor imagines, Meryl Streep imagines herself being, Margaret Thatcher or Julia Childs, and they kind of step into that role and they feel the experience of having, being in that role. So they're sort of feeling and imagining themselves in the role. So I would call it sort of, instead of cognitive empathy, I'm thinking it's more like an imaginative empathy, that you imagine yourself in any situation and then you sense the felt experience. So anyway, that's.
Oh, I think we're on the same page.
Yeah.
I think that the piece that you said, let's all clarify what we're all coming from. I think that's the first step anyway. And that's it. The key is to help our children kind of step into another world and see where the other person is, so that you can feel with the other person. And I love the companion. I love Carl Rogers.
Yeah.
And I think that term is just powerful.
So it's really, it's that sense of, with the children, in the sense that they're being sensitive to the felt experience. There's a difference with the imagining and then the feeling. Like, I do a lot of the active listening, the empathic listening, a la Carl Rogers. And there I'm just sitting, listening, observing, and following the person. Like, if it's a child, they're very upset, or I've done listening with my nephews. He gets in a fight with his sister. I'm not going to talk to anybody.
Yeah.
And then it's just like, oh, so you really don't want to talk with anyone. You're just feeling upset, or are you feeling upset? So being with the person sort of on their journey, which is sort of, for me, what sort of the basic, first step of empathy is. So I don't know, just.
No, I so agree with you. And I think that's the piece that across the board, particularly now in a very distracted, plugged in generation where we're tuning out to one another, the first step is tuning in.
Yeah.
So if we can just get kids to tune in, or parents to tune into their child, or just to sit and observe for a while, it may not be that you necessarily have empathy to begin with, but it's the beginning step to be able to get you closer to that, so you can.
So you've got to have a sense of awareness. You have to have that time and space to be with the child, or even be with themselves.
Yeah. Presence. I love that presence. That tuning everything out so the child knows you're there. I think that is just such a glorious commodity. And it creates, not only that, it builds up a sense of safety. You realize the person cares about me. It has so many other benefits, but I also think it's the critical first practicing piece. Many schools do that, where I love a paired sharing, that it's just nothing more than a 30-second check-in. I'm going to be taking roll or figuring out how many people want milk, but I want you to take a minute and turn to your partner, and every week it's a different partner. Just tune in, look eye to eye, and check how the other person is. Sometimes the beginning stage is just body language, because they're not used to body language. We're dealing with a generation of kids that are more comfortable texting than talking. So that observation, that tuning in is so critical, but I think it's also true for adults. We've become so plugged in that we really need to be able to just tune in. And that's the first step.
Yeah.
Scaffold it along the way.
Yeah. So it's having sort of that scattered awareness and attention, kind of maybe being off in your heads versus just being present with the other person. How do we develop that presence with each other?
I think there's also a caveat there that we also forget. And I think a gateway to empathy is also emotional intelligence. You've got to be able to tune in. Okay, I'm looking at him, but I also have to be able to figure out, what's he feeling? What's his voice tone sound like? Oh, voice tone is a lost art too. We used to pick up the phone, kids are texting. What does a voice tone sound like? Is he stressed? Is he upset? What do her eyes look like? What's her body language look like? All of those begin to help us feel with another person if we can radiate that. That's why I love that there's just talk emotions far more naturally with your children. I know we do a far better job with our daughters when they're 2 than we do with our sons when they're 2. We talk emotions far more with our girls, says Yale. So the first step is adding it also, just talking naturally emotions. Will you look sad, or look at my face? Or those wonderful children's literatures. Oh, I love when Sally gets mad, really, really mad, because it has those wonderful different facial expressions. And then the child gets up on your lap and make your face look like Sally. How does she feel? Make your face look like that. How do you think she's feeling? That's a big piece that we seem to be missing.
Well, I think that's the first. I was just looking at the outline of your book, and the first lesson. That's the first habit. You had 9 habits. The first one is empathic children can recognize, understand, and verbalize feelings. So it's the focusing on what is the felt experience that is going on, and how do we learn to be aware of them, to recognize them, and to be able to articulate them.
I think naturally, I noticed that many schools have big charts, feeling charts all over the walls, which is great. But even young children, my doctoral dissertation with 3 and 4-year-olds, and I was trying to figure out at what age do they learn emotions. And I discovered after interviewing like over 300 kids and doing little stories with them, that they learn happy and sad first, but they often then comes mad and scared, but they mix the last 3 up. So unless we talk a lot more about them and let them know that it's normal to have those feelings, everybody has feelings, how are you feeling? And then use them in context. So we can watch that glorious movie Inside Out. There's great ones to be able to help our kids learn emotional vocabulary. But the first step in that first habit is just make sure that our children have that habit, have an emotional vocabulary, because they're going to be able to tune in and understand. And that's going to help them be able to go, oh, she feels sad. I felt sad like that once. Or, oh, he looks really stressed. Let me see what I can do, because I know what that feels like. Let me help.
Well, the practice that I've been focusing on is, again, based on the work of Carl Rogers, because he did the empathic listening as a therapist and a client. So it was done within the therapeutic context. And, that's sort of a narrow context. It's like, you don't go to the therapist until you're, usually in distress and, for help.
Yes.
But that basic empathic listening and the active listening practice, which is, in quite a few fields, it seems that to me that's one of the most powerful first steps.
I so agree. Or just being able to, after you can see the emotion, another one is being able to pause and listen, because a lot of our children, their attention spans are so short. It's a pause, listen. Now repeat back one thing you just heard. It could be the beginning stage. It doesn't mean that you're going to get into the deep listening stage.
Yeah.
And then later on, one of the most brilliant, thinking of Carl Rogers, I was watching Virginia Satir years back, and it was having her put a chair just there. Now sit in the chair and pretend you're the person and repeat back.
Mm-hmm.
So it's an imagining and getting to that level, get you into a deeper stage. But I agree. I think that active listening is absolutely powerful. I think as a parent to do that back to a child. So I hear that you look really sad. Are you? I think that's what you're saying. Tell me what it is, or repeat back. It can be a really wonderful thing.
Yeah, it's the practice that we've been doing in my family. We, in fact, in a couple of weeks, we'll be having another family empathy circle. So we do them periodically, talking about family issues. And, for my family, I was kind of more progressive, liberal. They were Trump supporters, conservative. And, I had talked a lot about empathy to them, and they just didn't know what I was really meaning. It was a sort of an abstract term. And then one time there was a conflict happened in the family between my sister-in-law and mother. And it was like on Christmas, they were going at each other, one person was blaming the other for something. The other was saying, don't talk to me that way. And they were just, I know it was just like everything was just going to blow up. So I kind of stepped into that, and I started doing empathic listening with my sister-in-law. So, oh, you're really mad. You're feeling really angry that, the kids got into the Christmas gifts, and you think that my mother is to blame. Is that it? She said, yeah, it's right. It's her fault. And then I talked to my mother. It's like, oh, so I'm hearing you're really upset that, she's blaming you for this. Is that true? She says, yeah, that's what she's always blaming me for things. So I kind of like went back and forth, empathized with each side, and then had them start doing empathic listening with each other. Once they calmed down, they started feeling heard. They calmed down to the point. And I said, now would you reflect back what you hear the other person say until they feel heard, and then you'll have a chance. So everyone will have a chance to be heard. And they started doing it, and then they'd get off. Somebody would say something, and the other one would want to reply back. And I'd say, no, wait, just reflect back. You'll have your turn. And they started doing it. And then for about 20 minutes, and then the whole family kind of came into the circle. They'd all been hiding in the corners, try to get away from this conflict. And then it turned into this big family empathy circle. And it was it was almost like an onion, the conflict. We got deeper and deeper and deeper into the essence, which was not really about the gifts, but it was about a sense of belonging, not feeling, someone belonged in the family. And then it was like, oh, you belong, we care about you, hugs. And the whole thing ended like it was a spectacularly beautiful ending, with hugs all around. And then after that, everybody in the family knew. And then I said, that's empathy. And they said, oh, that's pretty good. And after that, we started doing regular family empathy circles, using this active shared empathic listening practice.
But what you also did there, just to reiterate the brilliance of it all, is the best way to teach it is by modeling it. Instead of, too often what we do is we tell, but we need to show.
Yeah.
So if we show what it looks like, then a child can easily copy it. But it's also not just the child, it's the adult. We can do that at a family meeting, which a lot of families do once a week. We do those in class meetings where every day it's a check-in of how you're doing, and maybe it's a topic. It could be the dinner time conversation, but it also could be the greatest opportunities in the carpool when our kids are locked in the door with us. We might as well turn off the radio and start listening. The experience that I had that was just the one that was mind-boggling was way far north in Alberta, and the superintendent had told me, you've got to get into the third grade class because they're teaching emotional literacy in the most profound way you could possibly imagine. So I'm game. What the heck are they doing? I walked in, and to this day I can still visualize it because it was so powerful. All the kids were sitting around a great big green rug quietly. They were very inclusive. They invited me to come over because the teacher wasn't there. They said they were waiting for the teacher. They told me their rules. Everybody's invited. Everybody shares, but make sure you sit real straight and don't startle. Why? I said, because the teacher startles real easily. And keep a big smile on your face. Why? Well, because she cries if you look sad. Now, I'm worried about the teacher, but I'm game. The door opens, in walks the teacher. She sits in the middle of the green rug. And for the next 30 minutes, it was the most brilliant lesson in empathy I've ever seen anywhere in the world, because it was taught by an 8-month-old baby named Clara. It was the Roots of Empathy program by Mary Gordon. But what I saw was immediately the teacher who did walk in with the mom, the class had adopted the baby, so it's our baby for the year. They're learning emotional literacy and the growth of emotional literacy on a baby. So here's the teacher priming. How does Clara seem to feel today? Oh, she looks really anxious. How do you know? Because she's just really tight like this. They were able to just qualify and quantify each one of her emotions, describe where they were. Mary has done phenomenal work on this with 800,000 kids around the world. But the most telling part was I turned to a little guy next to me, Mr. Verbal, and said, why does this work? And Mr. Verbal, third grader, turned and said, well, Clara's learning empathy, I said, I don't think it's just Clara, but why does it work for you? He said, well, it works because empathy is a verb. And I remember to this day going, whoa, I was so struck by it. I knew where he was coming from, but I wanted it to come from this kid's mouth. What does that mean? He said, you don't learn it as a word of the month. It's like you got to see it and feel it in order to get it. We're seeing it and feeling it and getting it from
Wow.
Clara, the baby.
Mm-hmm.
So I tell parents, you know, it isn't like you have to get pregnant. You can use the baby next door or a cousin that comes over. You can help the big kids train the puppy. You can help the big kids learn it from the littler kids. You can do cross-age tutoring. But sometimes we discover for shyer children, even learning it, this is all fabulous work from Yale, is have the older kid teach a younger kid, and he's
Mm-hmm.
less threatened with it. It's just what you want to do is just get the child's foot in the door, and then you can do so much more to just keep taking it up a notch and up a notch, because obviously emotional literacy is the grounds way. We got to keep moving up a notch.
Yeah, so you need those contexts, like
Yes.
you need a space there for the kids around the blanket. They have something to
Yes.
talk about. They're seeing something, they can talk about it, and somebody has to sort of hold the space too. There's got to be sort of an empathic space.
In a safe, caring,
Yeah.
inclusive
Uh-huh.
place.
Yeah.
The other thing is notice that this was ongoing. It wasn't a once a time activity like the parent, what I talked to him about yesterday, he's not being empathetic today. It's got to be ongoing. Find the ritual or the routine that's going to work for you, but get your foot in the door and keep doing it, because what you'll see is that your children will start to pick it up just like your family did. Wow, now I understand what empathy is. I know how I can listen a little more, and you can keep leveling it up and leveling it up so it becomes more and more profound. And more and
Yeah,
more.
there's a learning curve there too in how to do
Yes.
that. It's like, how as a parent do you like have the mindset for in the car or at dinner, or you need to
That's
be kind of like resourced yourself
that's
to
back
be
to the first
grounded.
conversation.
Hmm.
And that was the parlor groups from Montreal, when you talked about it together, when you practiced together. It's the staff meetings when you, let's talk about one thing and let's practice this one activity together before we go and do it. Or let's read the same book together, mom and dad, and then put a post-it note in the one activity we both agree upon, and let's put it on our data calendar so that we can at least start it. After a while, it becomes natural. After a while, you'll just naturally be the active listener and start talking emotions. But sometimes at the beginning stage, I think we've become as a culture, particularly United States, or more technologically driven, we're so grade obsessed and SAT testing obsessed that we feel like, I had one mother, how am I going to have time to do this when I'm trying to get my kid into getting an SAT score up? How do I possibly have time to talk about kindness? You weave it in. It's natural as a moment, but unless you put it as habit number 2, moral identity on those 9 habits, unless you realize that it matters in your home, and you take an enormous pledge to say, okay, this is how I want my child to turn out. I want him smart here, but I also want him smart here. It's going to backfire. You
Hmm.
won't get the results. And what will end up happening is over and over again, it didn't work. How often did you try it? Well, I tried it yesterday. Keep going with it. Because a lot of
Hmm.
times it's the adult curve that needs to go up the notch.
Yeah, it's that commitment and intention and ongoing
Yeah.
that you talked about at the beginning too. So how have you found that with? Because I find a lot of people, oh, let's do the empathy circle, or but then they lose interest. It's like, oh, it's not like real easy. There's
Yep.
it's hard work, especially if you're in a family and you do these empathy circles. I
Yep.
mean, it's like there's so much stuff buried under the carpet, under the
It's
rug,
a good analogy.
that hasn't been addressed. And it's like scary to open up that carpet, look underneath there, and you got to work through the mess. And it's kind of like scary, and people say, oh,
It
I'd
is,
rather.
but what happens too often is we start too big, or we
Hmm.
take on so much, and then we get overwhelmed and we go, I don't have time for it. I'm too stressed out, or there's so much on my plate. So I always tell parents, in fact, even at an hour workshop, or as you're reading a book, or as you're watching one of your videos, what I want you to do instead is just take an index card in front of you. And as the speaker keeps talking, or the writer is just writing all these ideas, find one that works for you. What's the one that you're most comfortable with? Write down that one idea. And it's usually a simple one, but commit yourself at least a minute a day for 21 days and mark it. In fact, what I also tell the parent to do, your most verbal kid in your family, tell him to be your reminder. They always do. Mom, you're supposed to be doing that active listening thing. What'll happen is you'll get into the habit, and pretty soon the whole family starts to change and gets to the habit. Then you add the next idea and the next idea. We take on too much.
So take it in little pieces and
take it in
build
little
and
pieces.
don't.
Even though empathy is huge, it's
Yeah.
not. I don't want to minimize how just powerful it is, how transformational, how encompassing it is, and how much there is to it. You'll never get anywhere if you have never even thought about empathy, or you want to change your parenting or your teaching or your relationships. Find one little thing that you can do, and then just keep saying, I'm going to add it on. I always tell parents, put it on a calendar and just mark it for yourself, or put it on your put it on your phone. Put it on your agenda so it opens up each day. I was working with First Nation groups in outside British Columbia, and they were weavers. So what I asked them all to do was bring in a long string of their yarn, because that's what was powerful to them. I gave them a lot of different ideas on things you can do in your family. Now you choose the one you're most comfortable with. Then I gave them each an index card, little small one, and I had them tie it to the end of the knot of the yarn. And I said, now on the end of the index card, here's the only thing I want you to do. Write down the one little simple thing that you want to try starting tonight or the next morning. And every time you try it, I want you to tie a knot in the yarn. Tie a knot in the yarn. I said, it's going to take at least 3 weeks for you to really make a habit. They all began to try at that time. But the elders emailed me back and said, you won't make what a difference this is making. They're all supporting each other, but they brought in their yarn with all of the knots. And I went, gosh, those are adults. Why don't we do the same thing to kids? So it's visual. We find the one simple thing, because otherwise we won't change ourselves.
Yeah, there's a lot of different, tools, a lot of different practices. The one I've been just really honing in on is the empathy circle.
Yes.
Practice, and that's that again, back to that active listening. It's sort of a starting point, and it's, we do empathy circles in small groups. It's sort of an empathy practice. So you get 4 people is a good amount. One person selects who they're going to speak to, and that person reflects back their understanding of what the speaker has said till the speaker feels heard to their satisfaction. And then, they say they're heard. And then the listener selects someone to speak to. And then, that person reflects back. So you kind of go around. It's like it's an empathic listening or active listening gym, where and we've done it with book, actually it'd be good to use your book as a book club for doing something like that. We've done it with books where you get a small group, you've got a book, you read a chapter, you come together, and then you discuss it using this empathy circle practice. And then, the next week you do it again. So it's this constant sort of practice of empathic listening as like a first step. That for me, it's like if everyone in the world learned just this, it's almost like a gateway. If you can just start with this, there's other things you can do, get better at articulating feelings and, reflecting feelings, but just the basic reflection of what you're hearing the person say is so powerful.
I think I'm so right. You're right on it, because it's the step in the door, and that's what we're trying to do. It's your foot in the door technique. The other thing is you can do that with a child, and you can do it around the dinner table, and everybody can share whatever it is. But when you get done sharing, the other person, brother, sister, dad, mom, or grandpa, cannot share until they reflect back. What's the most important thing? If you just do that as a small family, and you do that nightly, not your turn, because a lot of times we tune out. They don't hear what the other person is saying. So how can we possibly go up a level? That's a really easy thing. Turn back and listen. We do that in classrooms, and it's called SOLER, SOLER. I use acronyms because kids say they remember them for 25 years later. S is when you're doing this with your partner, you sit square, but you turn into one another, versus your partner. Always be open so you can hear where your person is saying from. L is lean in. I'm starting with the posture. E is empathize, hear where they're coming from so you can reflect back. And R is reflect what's the single most important thing you just heard that the person say, and the feeling tone that he said with it, If you do that, and you do that often, that's taken a lot of teachers, 30 seconds a day. Because teachers will say, I don't have a lot of time. It doesn't take much time if it's a routine and it's 30 seconds a day, but it's a check-in. Kids become more inclusive. They become more caring. They're checking into one another. Then you can add on to deeper thinking.
Mm-hmm.
You can add on to the convergent thinking. You can add on to the curiosity and creativity. By the way, this also opens up creativity and curiosity, because now you're more open to where the person's coming from. And that's what we want.
Yeah, and role playing too is you get that basic thing. Say, okay, well now take on the role. Like I've done it with high school students, where it's like, okay, take on the role of a supervillain and a superhero.
Yes.
And now have them do empathic listening with each other to work out their issues. And I mean, these discussions go on for like an hour. People can't believe that there's so much for the supervillain and superhero to talk about. And I did one too with God and Satan. Role-playing God and Satan, and it's like 2 hours of them, trying to work out their issues.
Yeah, it's finding that piece, and for a high school kid, that is powerful. It's kind of like the first piece to restorative justice that many schools are getting into, but they're not tuning in and listening to the other first person, and that's where we need to go. I think that whole part about discussions and conversations and hearing where the other person is coming from, trying to find a piece of commonality. Even when you're talking, as you get up a notch, it's trying to find the we factor. So often we're so biased when we meet a first person. No, now have a conversation, but your goal is to find one thing you have in common. And once you open that up, now you can find more and more. That could be the next piece that you open to.
Yeah, there's so many pieces that can be added, as well as that we piece. I think that's, it's core to your book too. It's one of the habits, I think, the we part, not us, them, think us, not them, for example. And I've noticed that in a lot of the empathy definitions, discussions, it's like, oh, if you're empathic, you'll kind of get taken advantage of.
No.
That there's this sense of you'll get burned out. But it's seeing it's an individualistic view of empathy, and not seeing what is the level of empathy in the relationship. Like there's you and I here. What's the level of our empathy? It's not just about me or just about you being empathic. It's like, what is the overall level of empathy in the relationship, or the overall empathy level in the family, in the classroom, the culture, really. And instead of just seeing you as this individual being empathic or not, it's like, well, let's look at the whole space, all the relationships, and how empathic are they, and what can we do? Because it's a different perspective, right? We have a perspective of just me as an individual versus and you can have that, at some time but you can shift, you can move, but you want to have also that perspective of the whole.
Exactly. And your piece that you mentioned too about, am I going to be eaten up if I'm too empathetic? Notice maybe we can talk just for a minute about what those 9 habits are. Because my goal was to not only help a child be empathetic, but also to be able to help the child be able to use it and be active, so he has his whole being into it, but can make a difference in the world. So yes, we can start with number 1 is we've got to learn emotional literacy. We've got that. Second one is we've got to help plant into the child that your moral identity. Because we do know that kids who speak out and stand up, defend one another, who are healthier with one another, see themselves as a caring person, says Nancy Eisenberg. We're doing great with the growth mindset, but let's also have an empathetic mindset, that you are an empathetic person, and plant in your child that I see you as a caring person, because you act how you see yourself to be. The third one is the perspective taking. That's the role playing. I love the role playing, the role taking. One of the coolest things I ever saw was a 9th grade teacher who was teaching Romeo and Juliet. The end test was, yes, you had the true, false, and multiple choice, but you had to come up to the front of the room. And there were, high schoolers having to stand on 4 different pieces of construction paper cut in shoes. And each shape was one character in Romeo and Juliet. So you stand on Romeo, where was he coming from? How would you feel if you were him? Now move to Juliet, that set of relatives, that set of relatives. Oh, it was like deep thinking.
Mm-hmm.
That was the role playing.
Yeah.
And getting into the shoes of someone else. Then we get into 4, 5, 6, 7, all the rest of the habits. Now it takes off that a moral imagination, journeying into the world through books, through literary fiction. We do know that, yeah, I mean, some of those books that you read as a kid last forever because they have that deepness to us. When parents say, how do I start? Start reading literary fiction, because the research says you're more likely to get into the shoes of the character, your empathy opens. Kids said the biggest concern is make sure that you relook at the kind of books you're telling us to read. Their favorites right now are still Wonder and still Outsiders. They love Harry Potter because they're all literary fiction and they're deeper. Then comes self-regulation. Because as stress builds a lot of times, some kids dial their empathy down to be able to handle their stress. But if you teach kids how to handle the stress, you can keep their empathy open. The mindfulness piece is fabulous. The empathetic mindfulness of thinking toward someone else. I spent some time in Tibet, and it was fabulous interviewing monks and why their empathy is so high. Then comes practicing kindness. The more you practice it, not just a random act, but ongoing, you open up and become more we, not me, until the final ones are collaboration, because there's where we want to be. We want to collaborate. We want to get kids to be team builders. Then comes moral courage. We want to help kids be able to speak out if you feel so concerned, if somebody's being treated unfairly, there's injustice or some kind of a horrible tragedy happening, or bullying. How do you stand up and speak out? Empathy fuels it. And the final one is altruistic leadership, helping the kid get into service projects, doing towards others, being an entrepreneur, and an innovator, but doing with an empathetic message behind it. I think that's how we make a difference in the world.
So there's that sense that moral aspect, that moral, empathic, moral courage. And that's something, yeah, that's like, how is one grounded? You know, how do we ground ourselves in that? Like, you know, we have this empathy tent where we take it to like political events, and like I'm here near Berkeley, and we have like the right wing, you know, comes and they do these rallies here.
Yep.
And then there's the counter left, and it's like it's a brawl. I mean, it's like literal blood, you know, people just battling it out. I mean, it's everything. M80s being thrown at each other, you know, you name it, pepper spray, bear mace. I mean, it's a knockdown, drag out fight. And we're trying to hold an empathic space. Like we're this small little group saying, hey, there's this other way, an empathic way. We try to listen to both sides. And it's like, what is it? I mean, to hold, it's tense. I mean, it's like pretty intense. You don't know what's going to happen. And it's like that sense of being grounded. And for me, what grounds me is that sense that I want a culture of empathy. You know, it's like empathy, a mutual empathy where everyone is heard, is sort of like that moral grounding that kind of gives me, you know, it gives me a point of reference in terms, and I'm like convinced that I've just seen it over and over again. If you can get those people who are totally pissed off with each other to listen, to be heard, to listen to each other. I mean, I've had people with they come together and they give each other hugs, you know. So I know it works, and it's a moral grounding for as a way of being.
It's powerful, isn't it?
Yeah.
I think one of the things that I saw that was really interesting is when the division in this country was going so high, and there was such polarization, that there was church groups that were opening up. And what they decided to do is the entire church group, you invite people to come to your house for dinner, but you invite people with different views. You taught them everybody to listen, just like you're talking about, an empathetic listening. And what happened is all these wonderful dinners started in the whole village and the town and the community. What began to happen is the divisions went down. The hate started to go down, and people started to listen to one another because they were in a safe spot. They were having dinner. It was a lovely time. They also were hearing where the other person was coming from, and it opened everybody's hearts up, and the division started to go down.
Yeah, and I wonder that, yeah, it's like you've had the experience, you've seen it as well, that I mean, you're very passionate about your empathy work, and I mean, so articulate, and all the different ideas around what to do. And I just wonder about, I'm looking at how do we have more of an impact on the culture. There's slowly more books being written, you know, more people are talking about it. The way that I'm looking at is, can we get high profile, leaders to do empathic listening with each other. So, for example, I ran into Gavin Newsom. I think you're in California, right?
Yes, I am.
So I said, hey, would you do an empathy circle with John Cox when they were doing in the primary? He says, oh, John Cox has no empathy. And I said, well, would you do an empathy circle with him if he agreed to do an empathy circle? I said, he's not going to do an empathy circle. I said, okay, I'll go check. And so it was kind of, I actually did get his campaign to say that he would do an empathy circle, but it was just before the election, wasn't time to pull it off. So I did run into John Cox a couple of months ago at the Republican convention, because we go to the Republican and the Democratic convention to try to bring the sides together to talk. And I ran into him and he said he would do it. So just the other week, I was here at the Democratic convention, ran into Gavin Newsom again. And I said, Gavin, you said, would you do an empathy circle with John Cox? And he didn't say anything. I said, oh, you're not going to answer me. And he said, okay, I'm open to it. I'm open to it. So now I'm going to try to see if I can get the left and the right to get these high profile people to take part in empathy circles. Somehow, you know what I'm saying is we're having this work. It's like, it seems like it's kind of going, it's hard. It's
hard, it's power, but it's intense. But I see a groundswell, and we are making a difference. Mm-hmm. And I think that what's happening, the biggest movement I've seen, for instance, when I wrote on Selfie, I wrote it for parents, but counselors and school teachers are the biggest ones that are reading it. So they're starting. It's this spillover effect. It's starting in schools. Now what they're doing is they're doing it, and now parents are doing it. Book club read-alouds, I think, are powerful. Your first step is knowledge. You're not going to be able to get them into an empathy circle unless they feel like, why the heck should I bother?
Yeah.
Is it really doable? Then you keep spreading the word. I will end this. Unfortunately, I've got to get
going. So you saw we're in out of time here.
One thing here is that the moment I started with Roots of Empathy, but the most powerful moment, the place that I've wanted to visit my whole life that I thought this is the hope, is Otisville, Maine, where they're doing Seeds of Peace. And every year they have a 3-week camp, started with an incredible visionary named John Wallach, who was an AP Wire reporter, always trying to get the peace accords, always covering in Washington, D.C., until one day he just threw up his hands and said, forget the adults, we're going to get nowhere. We got to start with the kids. So why don't we start a camp where we can get a group of kids together who we already know they're about 14 to 16 years of age, key years for moral identity, 14 to 16. Let's bring them in with a group of counselors like you who know how to do empathy circles, who know how to do active listening, who know how to teach the skills of empathy, and let us put them together and let's teach them how to be a good leader with empathy. And hopefully what we'll do is plant in them to become a seed of peace. Now, that sounds wonderful, but where they're coming from is the mind-boggling. They choose them each year from Israel, Palestine, Jordan, Egypt, United States, Pakistan, Afghanistan, India. They land late at night. They're scared to death because their entire life they've been taught to hate. And now they're going to be for 3 weeks without a cell phone at a camp with these kids that your parents have said, don't ever trust him, that's the enemy. And the most amazing thing is when I interviewed every kid, it was about 2.5 weeks into the camp, every kid said, this works. I said, what makes it work? Caring people, a culture that everybody knows what the expectations are. We practice dialogue circles. We practice how to get along. We practice how to listen to one another. Every kid said it takes at least 2.5 weeks, and all of a sudden, one kid, I'll start to cry. He said, what happens is you start to look at somebody who was your enemy for life, and you realize the enemy has a face, and you'll never be the same when you leave this place. You are changed from the inside out because you now have the skills to be able to figure out how to get along. That's the motto and where we need to go. In fact, the motto of the place is the way life could be. I looked at that and went, oh my gosh. But I see some camps are going in that direction. There's places called Our Town that are doing that across the United States. Seeds of Peace. Leaders are doing it inside schools. I think the biggest stumbling block is the grown-ups. We got to get our act together and start
Yeah.
doing it. How
Well, that's where we're headed, is trying, I think as we're both working towards, is that the beauty of that sense of connection.
yeah.
You know, we bring people, we're trying to bring people together. We're trying to overcome those barriers and have people connect with
Yeah.
each other. So, and I'm glad you and I got to connect
I
with
am
each
so
other.
glad we got
It's
to talk.
been taking a while, but we've managed it. And, you know, let's keep up the conversation. You know, I know you have to go and I could talk for hours with you. And
Likewise.
we'll,
Yeah. Thank you.
yeah.
I think we're on a mission together, and I think that the bottom line on this, it's doable and it's urgent.
Okay. Thank you, Michele.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Bye.